guests and esteemed Dear guests and esteemed participants, good evening and good morning, Swami, to this remarkable online lecture series, Interreligious Hermeneutics. My name is Ibrahim Kochid and I have the privilege of serving as a moderator for this event today. It is an honor to have all of you joining from us various parts of the world. I see people from Germany, Austria, and Swami for you from the US. I think more will be entering in the following minutes. Before we commence with the presentation, I would like to inform you that this Zoom conference is being recorded and will be saved as a video for future reference. And to ensure a smooth and distraction-free conference experience, and I kindly ask or request that all participants please turn off your microphones and cameras during the session, unless you're actively speaking or participating. This will help us maintain clear audio and visual communication, preventing any unintended disruption or background noises. And for questions, you could also use the chat. Before we embark on this exciting journey of exploration and learning, allow me to provide a brief introduction and overview of this lecture series. Throughout this lecture series, we had the opportunity to delve into a diverse range of interreligious hermeneutics. We had a brief introduction to religious alterity and differential hermeneutic, where Professor Danz gave us an insight how to understand religion in general. In the second lecture, we had Professor Al-Omari, where she had an alternative reading of other holy scriptures than the Quran. And today we have a special guest from LA. I don't want to anticipate anything, so I'll go straight to introduce Swami Medhananda, Ayon Maharaj, a monk of the Ramakrishna order, an academic philosopher and a renowned scholar in the field of philosophy and religion. He doesn't bring just academic experience, where he is currently a senior research fellow. He's also serving as a Hindu chaplain at both UCLA and the University of Southern California, actively engaging with students and promoting interfaith understanding. Swami Medhananda's extensive research focus on global philosophy of religion, Indian scriptural hermeneutic, and Vedantic philosophical traditions. He has published multiple books, including Swami Vivekananda's Vedantic Cosmopolitanism and Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, which have garnered critical acclaim. He has been invited to lecture at prestigious institutions around the world, including Princeton University, Oxford University, and École Normale Supérieure. He holds a PhD from the University of California and has received recognition as a Fulbright scholar and visiting student at renowned academic institutions. Swami, I kindly invite you to take the virtual podium. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim, for inviting me. It was a pleasure meeting you last year in person in Birmingham, and hopefully we'll meet again soon. And I look forward to the discussion after my presentation. So let me try to share my screen. So interfaith hermeneutics in Hinduism, from Advaitic inclusivism to religious pluralism. So what I plan to do in the presentation today is to distinguish two basic forms of or paradigms of religious diversity within Hinduism. One is what I characterize as Advaitic inclusivism, and the second is what I call religious pluralism. And Advaitic inclusivism, we'll see, was championed by the followers of Shankara. And the religious pluralism I want to talk about within Hinduism was defended by a 19th century Indian mystic named Sri Ramakrishna. So let's begin first with the Advaitic inclusivist paradigm. Shankara, most of you, if you know something about Indian philosophy, you've probably heard of Shankara. He was considered to be an 8th century philosopher in India. And he was the one who codified and wrote commentaries defending the philosophy of Advaita Vedanta, the non-dual school of Vedanta. And the famous formula, Sanskrit formula, is the following to capture this philosophy of Shankara's: Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya Jivo Brahmevana Paraha. Brahman alone is real. The world is unreal. The individual is none other than Brahman. Brahman here means the ultimate reality, and Shankara defines the ultimate reality as strictly impersonal, non-dual, pure consciousness. So the personal God is not included in the ultimate reality. So that's the first tenet. The sole reality is Brahman, which is non-dual, pure consciousness. Two, the world, the personal God, in Sanskrit, the term is Ishvara, and individual souls, called jivas in Sanskrit, are all empirically real, but ultimately non-existent. Three, we attain liberation, moksha, by attaining knowledge of our true nature as Brahman. Each of us, in our essence, is identical with non-dual pure consciousness. Four, there's one particular spiritual path called the path of knowledge, the yoga of knowledge, jnana yoga, which leads directly to liberation. But five, there are other paths like bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion toward a personal God, and karma yoga, the yoga of unselfish works, selfless action. They're also useful, but they lead only indirectly to liberation, not directly, by purifying and concentrating the mind, thereby making us eligible to practice the higher spiritual practice of jnana yoga, the path of knowledge. So there's clearly a hierarchy of spiritual practices in play here in Shankara's school. The highest path is the path of knowledge. Other paths are not hopeless, but they can only take you part of the way. They can help make you eligible to practice the higher path of knowledge. So if we were to explain that, now what happens is he was in the 8th century, he didn't even talk about non-Hindu religions, okay? So since our topic today is interfaith hermeneutics, what interests me is the way that many modern followers of Shankara have kind of adapted his framework and broadened it to encompass the world religions. And I think this is the way that these modern Advaitins, I'm thinking, for instance, of Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, T.M.P. Mahadevan, and others. This is how I see modern Advaita Vedantins, modern followers of Shankara, harmonizing the world religions. Okay. So it would be something like this. Christians, through the path of Christianity, can attain realization, spiritual knowledge of the Christian God. Muslims, through the path of Islam, can realize God as Allah. Theistic Hindus can realize God in various forms like Rama, Krishna, Kali, or Shiva. But notice that none of these have reached the top of the mountain. What they've realized are various forms of what Advaitins will call Saguna Brahman, the personal God. Saguna means with attributes. So the personal God with omni attributes, like omniscience and omnipotence. But this is not tantamount to liberation, to moksha, liberation from the cycle of rebirth. So they all have to do something extra. What's that extra? Christians have to ultimately leave off their Christian practice and practice the Advaitic path of knowledge, jnana yoga. And only then can they reach the top of the mountain, which represents realization of impersonal, non-dual Brahman, pure consciousness. That alone is liberation. And that's true of Muslims, that's true of theistic Hindus as well. And these are just 3 examples. We can add other religions as well, Buddhists and Jews and many other religions, Sikhs. So this in a nutshell is what I take to be an Advaitic inclusivist paradigm for harmonizing the world religions. And I want to just bring a little bit more conceptual precision to my talk of inclusivism and pluralism. So most of you are very familiar with this paradigm, I'm sure, but the American theologian Alan Race presented this 3-fold typology of ways of understanding religious diversity. And I'm just going to, so these are not his direct definitions. These are my rough and ready definitions for the purposes of this presentation. So exclusivism is the view that only one religion leads to salvation, while all other religions fail to lead to salvation. So an example of this, of an exclusivist, would be Karl Barth, the Protestant theologian. Inclusivism is the view that only one religion leads directly to salvation, but other religions lead indirectly to salvation or afford lesser forms of salvation. So on the Christian side, Karl Rahner, the Catholic the German Catholic theologian, is an example. He had this idea that non-Christians are what he called anonymous Christians. So they can also attain salvation through the grace of Christ, but without knowing it. But there's still a kind of hierarchy there. It's better to be Catholic, right? And on the Indian side, it seems to me that Advaita Vedanta is a paradigm example of an inclusivist paradigm, what I just explained in the previous 2 slides. I hope it's clear from the mountain diagram why it's inclusivist, because only the Advaita Vedantins occupy the top, the peak of Mount Everest, or whatever that mountain is. And other religious paths can help take you part of the way, but none of them can take you all the way, except for the path of Advaita Vedanta. And finally, religious pluralism. This is the view that multiple religions are equally capable of leading to salvation. On the Christian side, we have theologians or philosophers like John Hick and Paul Knitter. And on the Indian side, for the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to argue that Sri Ramakrishna was a robust religious pluralist. And I think that his understanding or his mode of harmonizing the world religions can be interestingly compared with and contrasted with the inclusivist paradigm of Advaita Vedanta. So, Sri Ramakrishna, who was he? He was a 19th century Bengali mystic, born in 1836, passed away in 1886. He practiced, one thing that was very unique about him is that he practiced spiritual disciplines in a number of different religious traditions. Within Hinduism, he practiced Tantra, but he also practiced Vaishnavism. He also practiced Advaita Vedanta. But even more remarkably, he practiced the path of Islam and Christianity as well. And on the basis of all these different religious practices, he claimed to have had numerous types of spiritual experiences, both theistic and non-theistic. And on the basis of all of these different spiritual practices and spiritual experiences, he affirmed the harmony of all religions. Famously, he said, as many faiths, so many paths. The original Bengali is Maut Pot, as many faiths, so many paths. So let's try to go a little bit more deeply into how Ramakrishna harmonized the world religions. The first thing to point out is that I think that there have been 2 common misconceptions about Ramakrishna's doctrine of the harmony of religions. So other scholars, how have they interpreted his views? Number 1, Ramakrishna held that all religions are true. So one example is Frank Morales. He's a scholar who claims that Ramakrishna believed that all religions are true. A second misconception is promulgated even by some monks of our order. Swami Dhireshananda is an example. He and others claim that Ramakrishna harmonized the world religions on the basis of classical Advaita Vedanta, what I just described in the first 2 slides of my presentation, according to which the common goal of all religious paths is the realization of impersonal, non-dual, pure consciousness. What I want to argue is that contrary to the first misconception, Ramakrishna held not that all religions are true. He never claimed that all religions are true, but that all religions are effective paths to the same goal of God realization. And contrary to the second misconception, he never held that devotees of the personal God, in Sanskrit the term is bhaktas, he never claimed that devotees of the personal God must attain Advaitic realization of pure consciousness. So he never actually held the kind of mountain view that I showed in the second slide of my presentation, that theistic religious practitioners cannot attain the highest goal of salvation. So I think he was a robust religious pluralist in contrast to Advaita Vedanta. So to appreciate Ramakrishna's religious pluralism, I think we have to have a deeper understanding of his teachings on 2 spiritual states, which he called jnana and vijnana. So let me read you this quotation. He says, the jnani, meaning the knower of Brahman, the knower, gives up his identification with worldly things, discriminating not this, not this. Only then can he realize Brahman. It is like reaching the roof of a house by leaving the steps behind one by one. But the Vijnani, who is more intimately acquainted with Brahman, realizes something more. He realizes that the steps are made of the same materials as the roof, bricks, lime, and brick dust. That which is realized as Brahman through the eliminating process of not this, is then found to have become the universe and all its living beings. The Vijnani sees that the reality which is impersonal, nirguna, is also personal, saguna. This is known as Vijnana. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. The Jnani, according to Ramakrishna, is the classical Advaita Vedantin, the follower of Shankara that I described in the first 2 slides, who attains spiritual realization of the impersonal, non-dual Brahman, pure consciousness, through the practice of Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, the yoga of knowledge. But the Vijnani, Sri Ramakrishna says that there's a further stage of spiritual experience, which he calls Vijnana. The Vijnani is the person who has attained this greater state of Vijnana. The Vijnani goes beyond the Advaitic Jnani by realizing that Brahman is not only impersonal, nirguna, but also personal, saguna. It's also the personal God with omni attributes. While the Jnani dismisses the universe as what Ramakrishna called a framework of illusion, dhokartati, the Vijnani embraces the universe as a mansion of mirth, mojakuti, as a real manifestation of God. So because everything is God, the Vijnani sees this world as a real manifestation of God rather than as a kind of illusion or dream. So on the basis of this spiritual experience of Vijnana, my claim, and I developed this in detail if you're interested in chapter 1 of my book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality. I call Ramakrishna's philosophy Vijnana Vedanta because I think it's a Vedantic philosophy based on the spiritual state of Vijnana. And I want to just mention 3 key tenets of Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta that are relevant to today's discussion. 1, the soul reality is the infinite divine reality, which is the impersonal, non-dual Brahman in one aspect, and the personal God, Shakti, in another aspect. He used to teach Brahma or Shakti Abhed. And by Brahman, so what that means is Brahman and Shakti are inseparable. And he would give analogies, like he said, just as fire and fire's power to burn are inseparable. In the same way, the impersonal, non-dual pure consciousness on the one hand, and the personal God on the other are inseparable and equally real aspects of one and the same infinite divine. Second tenet of Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta, the world and all individual souls are real manifestations of Shakti, the personal God. Third tenet, Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion for a personal God, Karma Yoga, the path of selfless action, and Raja Yoga, the yoga of concentration and meditation, are all direct paths to the goal of God realization. So there's no hierarchy of yogas here in the way that you find in Shankara or in other traditional schools of Vedanta. He puts all the spiritual disciplines, all the yogas on an equal salvific footing. So to sum up, Ramakrishna's philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta is a Shakti affirming, so it affirms the personal God, and it's a life affirming Advaita philosophy. If we were to put it in a formula in Sanskrit, instead of Shankara's formula, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, which means Brahman alone is real and the world is unreal, I think Ramakrishna holds Brahma Shakti Satyam Jagat Satyam. So the ultimate reality is both non-dual pure consciousness on the one hand and the personal God on the other, which he called Shakti, Brahma Shakti Satyam, and Jagat Satyam. The world is not unreal, but it's actually a real manifestation of God. So it's still an Advaitic philosophy, but it's a kind of all-encompassing Advaita. It's an all-encompassing non-duality that encompasses the reality of this world and the personal God and all individual souls. Now, let's get to his religious pluralist model. So Ramakrishna's Vijnana-based ontology of the impersonal, personal, infinite divine, his understanding of the ultimate reality as both personal and impersonal, serves as the basis of his religious pluralism. So this is one of my favorite teachings of his on religious pluralism. He says, God is infinite and the paths to God are infinite. The original Bengali is Tini Ananto, Patho Ananto. One of the reasons I like this teaching is that he explains why there are infinite paths to God. There are infinite paths to God because God himself is infinite. So because God is infinite, there should be correspondingly infinite paths to reaching God. So I think that it's a very kind of succinct logic to justify religious pluralism. So to cash it out in a little bit more detail, devotees of the personal God, in Sanskrit the term is bhaktas, through their respective religious paths, attain spiritual knowledge of some form or aspect of the personal, the Shakti dimension of the impersonal, personal, infinite divine. So whether you're a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew or a Sikh or a theistic Hindu, you will realize different forms of the personal dimension of the infinite divine. You'll reach the highest goal, but in the form of God that you love most. And Advaita Vedantins, through the practice of Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, attain the knowledge of non-dual Brahman, non-dual pure consciousness, which is the impersonal aspect of the same infinite divine. They're not attaining realization of a different ultimate reality. It's the same ultimate reality, but in its impersonal aspect. So to illustrate the harmony of religions, Ramakrishna often told the parable of a chameleon, which I want to read. It's quite striking. Once a man entered a forest and saw a small animal on a tree. He came back and told another man that he had seen a creature of a beautiful red color on a certain tree. The second man replied, when I went into the forest, I also saw that animal. But why do you call it red? It is green. Another man who was present contradicted them both and insisted that it was yellow. Presently, others arrived and contended that it was gray, violet, blue, and so forth and so on. At last, they started quarreling among themselves. To settle the dispute, they all went to the tree. They saw a man sitting under it. On being asked, he replied, yes, I live under this tree and I know the animal very well. All your descriptions are true. Sometimes it appears red, sometimes yellow, and at other times blue, violet, gray, and so forth. It is a chameleon, and sometimes it has no color at all. Now it has a color, and now it has none. And then Ramakrishna explains the moral of this parable. He says, in like manner, one who constantly thinks of God can know God's real nature. He alone knows that God reveals himself to seekers in various forms and aspects. God is personal as well as impersonal. Only the man who lives under the tree knows that the chameleon can appear in various colors, and he knows further that the animal at times has no color at all. It is the others who suffer from the agony of futile argument. So I want to point to, just draw out 4 of the main features of this parable of the chameleon. First, the various colors of the chameleon correspond to different forms of the personal God. We can think of the personal God as Christ. We can think of the personal God as Krishna, and so on and so forth. Second key feature, the colorless chameleon corresponds to impersonal, non-dual, pure consciousness, the ultimate reality as conceived by Advaita Vedantins. Third feature, notice that the colorless chameleon is not, it wouldn't make sense to say that it's in any way more true than the colored chameleon, which means that the devotee's realization of the personal God, so the theistic conception of God, has the same ontological status as the jnani's realization of non-dual pure consciousness. So the personal God and the impersonal Brahman are put on an equal ontological footing. Fourth key feature, the person sitting under the tree, this very unusual person who's sitting under the tree 24 hours a day, unlike the other people who just come for a minute to see the chameleon at a particular point in time, this person sees the chameleon in various forms and as colorless. That person sitting under the tree represents the Vijnani, the person who has had this more expansive spiritual knowledge of God as both impersonal and as personal, and who revels in the various forms of God, recognizing that they're all true. So now, to revisit the mountain metaphor that I've been using, remember the second slide where I try to explain the Advaitic inclusivist paradigm. I want to contrast Ramakrishna's religious pluralism with that Advaitic inclusivism. So this is how I see Ramakrishna's harmonization of the world religions working. Christians, through the path of Christianity, by following the teachings in the Bible and other scriptures, will directly attain the peak of the mountain. They're going to realize some aspect or form of the impersonal, personal, infinite reality, which leads directly to salvation. They don't need to do anything more. They can realize the highest goal through their path. Likewise for Muslims, likewise for Hindus, likewise for Jews, likewise for Advaita Vedantins. Advaita Vedantins will reach the peak of the mountain but not by realizing the personal God, because they consider that to be a lower reality. But by the peak of the mountain for them represents realization of their true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. But because Ramakrishna holds that the ultimate reality is equally personal and impersonal, Advaita Vedantins also reach the top of the mountain, but just they realize the impersonal aspect of the same infinite divine. And Buddhists, likewise, Buddhists also reach the top of the mountain, but for them too, they're not interested in realizing a personal God, but they attain nirvana, which is also encompassed by this infinite divine. Now, Ramakrishna also has a very interestingly expansive conception of final salvation. What does salvation look like according to Ramakrishna's religious pluralist view? According to Ramakrishna, there are two fundamentally different types of spiritual aspirants. On the one hand, bhaktas, devotionally oriented people, people who are drawn toward theism, who strive to cultivate a loving relationship with the personal God in whatever form they love, and jnanis, intellectually oriented people, philosophically inclined people like Advaita Vedantins and Buddhists, who strive for nirvana, but nirvana defined in a broad way, not just in a narrowly Buddhistic sense, as a salvific state in which no sense of individuality remains. So they don't want to remain in some kind of higher heaven as an individual soul. In contrast to traditional schools of Vedanta, Ramakrishna grants equal value to both the Advaitic ideal of nirvana, of total dissolution of the individuality and non-dual Brahman, and devotional theistic ideals of salvation, so ideas of a heaven, of an eternal heaven. And according to Ramakrishna, the form of salvation we choose depends on our individual temperament and preference. So as he used to put it, bhaktas, theistic religious practitioners, devotees of the personal God, bhaktas do not want to become sugar, they want to eat sugar, okay? So while some spiritual aspirants seek to merge their individuality in the impersonal non-dual Brahman, that's what Ramakrishna refers to as becoming sugar. You become one with the ultimate reality. Devotees of the personal God tend to prefer to retain a sense of individuality in order to enjoy the bliss of loving communion with the personal God in an eternal heaven. That's what Ramakrishna calls eating sugar. In order to eat sugar, you have to be separate from sugar, right? So he accepts both of these fundamentally different paradigms of salvation. One is an eternal heaven paradigm in which one dwells with the personal God in a loving relationship, and the other is merging one's individuality in pure consciousness. Now, where does he say this? I just want to give one example. There's a dialogue between him and a follower of Shankara named Mahima. And this Advaita Vedantin asks, he says, I have a question to ask, sir. A bhakta needs nirvana sometime or other, doesn't he? So just to explain what the question is, he's thinking of theistic religious practitioners who believe in a personal God. That's what he means by a bhakta. And his intuition is this Advaitic inclusivist intuition, which is that by worshiping the personal God, you can't reach the highest goal. Ultimately, you have to leave off that practice and then practice Advaita, the path of knowledge. And then you can attain the highest goal, which is realization of your true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. So he's trying to get Ramakrishna to endorse the kind of Advaitic inclusivist paradigm that I was showing to you in the first two slides of my presentation. But notice how Ramakrishna responds. He says, it cannot be said that bhaktas need nirvana. There is a state in which the eternal Krishna is with his eternal bhaktas, devotees. Nitto Krishnata Nitto Bhakto. Krishna is spirit embodied, or I think it's better translated as consciousness. Krishna is consciousness embodied, and his abode also is consciousness embodied. Chinmoy Sham, Chinmoy Dham. Krishna is eternal, and the bhaktas also are eternal. Nitto Krishna, Nitto Bhakta. So I hope it's clear that Ramakrishna, he says, no, it's not the case. I don't accept Advaitic inclusivism. Bhaktas can reach, theistic religious practitioners can reach the highest goal through their own theistic path. It's just that the goal for them takes a different form. It takes the form of residing in an eternal heaven with the personal God. He gives another example, the example of an infinite ocean. He says the following, Satchit Ananda is like an infinite ocean. Satchit Ananda means existence, consciousness, bliss. It's a kind of epithet to refer to the ultimate reality in Vedanta. Satchit Ananda is like an infinite ocean. Intense cold freezes the water into ice, which floats on the ocean in blocks of various forms. Likewise, through the cooling influence of bhakti, of devotion toward the personal God, one sees forms of God in the ocean of the absolute. These forms are meant for the bhaktas, the lovers of God. But when the sun of knowledge rises, the ice melts. It becomes the same water it was before. Water above and water below, everywhere, nothing but water. And then he adds crucially, but you may say that for certain devotees, God assumes eternal forms. The Bengali is Nitya Shakar. There are places in the ocean where the ice does not melt at all. It assumes the form of quartz. So this is how I understand this analogy that he's using of the infinite ocean. Since Ramakrishna conceives this divine, this infinite divine reality expansively as both the impersonal non-dual absolute, Brahman on the one hand, and as the personal God on the other, which he calls Shakti, his conception of the salvific goal of all religions is equally expansive. For non-theistic spiritual aspirants like Advaita Vedantins and some Buddhists, salvation may not be the right word, actually, liberation might be better. Liberation consists in the total dissolution of one's individuality in non-dual pure consciousness. By contrast, for spiritual aspirants in theistic religious traditions like Vaishnavism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Sikhism, and so on, salvation takes the form of eternal loving communion with the personal God in a transcendental realm. So I like to think of Ramakrishna's view of salvation, of the final eschatological post-mortem state of salvation, as a many-roomed mansion. And so the different rooms represent different kinds of theistic heavens and different paradigms of salvation. And just as it's coherent for multiple people to be inhabiting different rooms of the same mansion, I think it's equally coherent from a philosophical standpoint for there to be a very expansive kind of ontology of final salvation where Advaita Vedantins can be resting in their true nature as non-dual pure consciousness, while at the same time, other souls, some of them might be dwelling in a Christian heaven, others might be dwelling in a Muslim heaven, Jannah, others might be in the Vaishnava heaven called Goloka, and I don't see any kind of contradiction there. Since there are various lokas, realms, so this is a Sanskrit term in Hinduism for eternal heavens, there are many different lokas, many different heavens. There are also multiple theistic forms of salvation. So it's not that all theistic religious practitioners, whether you're practicing Christianity or Islam or theistic Hinduism, all end up in the same heaven. While devotees of Krishna can dwell eternally with their beloved Krishna in Vaikuntha Loka, Christians can dwell with Christ or God the Father in their Christian heaven, Muslims can commune with Allah in their eternal paradise, Jannah, and so on. In short, Ramakrishna was not only a religious pluralist who held that different religious paths are equally capable of leading to salvation, but he was also what I would call a salvific pluralist, in that he held that salvation itself takes a variety of forms depending on the temperament and preferences of different souls. So if any of you are familiar with the literature on religious pluralism, S. Mark Heim has written a book called Salvations, where he critiques John Hick's, what he considers to be John Hick's monolithic understanding of salvation. Because he understands it, I agree with Heim on this point, that Hicks seems to understand salvation as a single unitary state that everybody reaches. And Heim says that's problematic because different religious traditions have different views on the final state of salvation. And so the best form of religious pluralism needs to accommodate multiple forms of salvation. And I think one virtue of Ramakrishna's religious pluralism, as opposed to a paradigm like Hicks, is that he actually embraces different forms of salvation as equally true and equally valuable. Now, every religious pluralist has to face this problem, the problem of conflicting religious truth claims. And so I want to summarize briefly how Ramakrishna responds to the problem of conflicting religious truth claims. What's the problem? The problem is the following. If different religions make conflicting claims about historical and metaphysical realities, then how can all religions be valid? So to give you just two examples, one question, did Christ die on the cross? Christianity says yes, Islam says no. Is rebirth true? Are we reborn? Or Abrahamic religions in their orthodox forms say no. They say rebirth is not true. But Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism say yes, there is rebirth. These are conflicting truth claims in different world religions. Now, how does Ramakrishna respond to this problem? Crucially, Ramakrishna never claimed that all religions are true, contrary to some scholars like Frank Morales, what they think. But he claimed that all religions are salvifically efficacious. They have equal salvific efficacy. That's what he claimed. All the major world religions. So now, to help us gain some precision in Ramakrishna's response to the problem of conflicting religious truth claims, I think it helps to bring in Hick's classification of 3 different kinds of disagreements. Okay, so the first kind is what he calls disagreements about past historical events that are in principle accessible to human observation. So an example he gives is the question of whether Christ died on the cross. If somebody took a time machine and went back to time 0, they could just verify whether Christ actually died on the cross or not. Second, disagreements about what Hick calls trans-historical matters, which cannot be verified by or verified definitively by historical or other empirical evidence. So he's thinking of sort of metaphysical doctrines like rebirth. There's some question these days about whether rebirth can be empirically verified because of the work of Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker and others. But leaving that aside, he's saying these are kind of conflicting religious truth claims about trans-historical matters. And third, disagreements about what Hick calls ultimate questions, such as the nature of ultimate reality. Is God personal or impersonal? If God is personal, what form does the personal God take, and so on and so forth. And there are all sorts of conflicts across the world religions about ultimate questions. Now, I think that Ramakrishna responds to or handles the first 2 types of disagreements in one way, and he handles the third type of disagreement about ultimate questions in a different way. So I want to distinguish these 2 approaches. So first, what's Ramakrishna's stance on conflicting historical and trans-historical religious truth claims? So Hick's 1 and Hick's 2. According to Ramakrishna, historical and trans-historical doctrines are not soteriologically vital for everyone. Okay, so he says this for instance, in the following passage: that yearning, vyapulata, is the whole thing. Whatever path you follow, whether you are a Hindu, a Muslim, a Christian, a Shakta, a Vaishnava, or a Brahma, the vital point is yearning. God is our inner guide, antaryami. It doesn't matter if you take a wrong path. Only you must be restless for him. God himself will put you on the right path. Besides, there are errors in all paths. Everyone thinks his watch is right. But as a matter of fact, no watch is absolutely right. But that doesn't hamper one's work. So just to explain this a little bit. So the idea is, he's saying, no religion has a monopoly on truth. No religion is 100% true. Every religion has at least some doctrinal errors. But he insists that even those errors don't detract from the salvific efficacy of that religion as a path to salvation. On the other hand, he thinks that there are some historical and trans-historical doctrines, like, for instance, Christ dying on the cross as a form of atonement, right, and redeeming mankind. Obviously, that is soteriologically vital for many Christians. What Ramakrishna is claiming is that that doctrine is nonetheless not soteriologically vital for everyone. So even if people like Muslims don't accept that Christ died on the cross, that doesn't handicap Muslim religious practitioners from the standpoint of salvation. Okay. But I think that Ramakrishna's stance on conflicting truth claims about the ultimate reality, so Hick's number 3, so disagreements about the nature of the ultimate reality, is interestingly different. From the standpoint of Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta, religious truth claims about the ultimate reality are complementary rather than conflicting. What seem to be conflicting truth claims about the ultimate reality turn out to be complementary if we take a broader view. So he often uses the parable of the blind man and the elephant to illustrate this. Many of you are probably familiar with it. It's not unique to him. It has a long tradition in India. But just to summarize it briefly, there's a giant elephant and there are 5 blind men, each touching a different part of the elephant. One person touches the trunk and says the elephant is dry and scaly. Another person touches the tail of the elephant and starts arguing and saying, no, the elephant is soft and furry, and so on and so forth. And the 5 blind men are fighting with each other about the nature of the elephant. And there's one person who can see the entire elephant who adjudicates the debate and says, you guys are all right and you're all wrong. You're all right because you're all touching different parts of the same elephant. But you're mistaken in generalizing based on your experience of the elephant. So I think Ramakrishna will say, each religion in the world captures a unique aspect or form of the impersonal, personal, infinite, divine reality. But no religion captures the whole of the infinite reality. So no religion can give you a picture of the entire infinite divine, because that's not possible. There is a kind of apophatic dimension to Ramakrishna's view of God, as well as a cataphatic dimension. I mean, there's kind of both. So now, just to sum up, the four key features of Ramakrishna's Vijnana-based religious pluralism. First key feature, the major world religions are equally effective paths to realizing some aspect or form of one and the same impersonal, personal, infinite, divine. And so it's a really robust religious pluralism rather than just a kind of inclusivism. Second, since the personal God and the impersonal absolute are different but equally real aspects of one and the same infinite divine reality, theistic and non-theistic religions are placed on an equal ontological footing. So there's no hierarchy between theism and non-theism here. They're placed on an equal footing. Third, Ramakrishna endorses an expansive view of salvation, the final eschatological state after we depart from our physical bodies. Instead of imposing a single narrow salvific goal onto all the world religions, along the lines, I think, arguably of John Hick, for instance, Ramakrishna teaches that a theist can dwell in an eternal heaven with the personal God. And remember, there are multiple heavens, while an Advaitin can merge his or her individuality in non-dual pure consciousness. And fourth and finally, his broad conception of the impersonal, personal, infinite divine reality provides what I think is a robust ontological rationale for active interreligious dialogue. In what sense? Well, because each of the world religions captures and describes in a really unique way real aspects of one and the same infinite divine. And because that's the case, each one of us as religious practitioners grounded in a particular religious tradition stands to learn from other religions in an active way, because we can learn more about the infinite divine. So if I'm Hindu, I can learn more about the infinite divine by studying Islam and by reading the Quran, by studying the Bible, and trying even incorporating aspects of Christian and Muslim and Jewish spiritual practice into our own respective religious traditions. So if any of you are interested in more details and a more kind of rigorous development of what I've been talking about today, please look especially at chapters 3 and 4 of my book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion, published by Oxford University Press in 2018. Thanks a lot. I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Swami. Thank you for your insightful talk. I really liked it because to see the different ways to understand, I mean, to see the pluralistic ideas is very insightful. I also like the metaphor of the chameleon and the eating sugar and becoming sugar, because it also reminds me on the Islamic mysticism. Hallaj Mansour, I don't know if you've heard about him.
Yes, yes.
But now let's open the door for the questions. There are two ways of asking questions. First, you could just open your microphone and video and then ask your questions probably. And then the second way is asking questions through the chat. And if you ask your question through the chat, I will read it, and then Swami, you have the chance to answer it. There's a question of Lena, I see. How does the legacy of Ramakrishna's teaching on religious pluralism continue to influence interfaith dialogue and understanding in contemporary society?
Sure. Yeah, so as Ibrahim mentioned in his introduction before my presentation, I'm actually involved in interfaith dialogue on the ground here in the US, for instance. So yeah, I mean, I tend to teach this view on religious pluralism. one thing I do find, which is, I mean, I'm a little frustrated by it, but I find that in interfaith dialogue, at least the ones that I've attended, usually people don't tackle theological questions. It's seems very superficial to me. I mean, there are probably exceptions, and I wasn't attending the right interfaith conferences, but usually they kind of shy away from discussing what is the underlying theological or philosophical framework for understanding, other religious traditions. I think their concern is that if you actually go deep into the theological frameworks, you're going to come upon differences, fundamental differences, which are going to cause friction rather than kind of unity and a feeling of fraternity. And so they choose to kind of avoid or sidestep the issues, but I like addressing these issues head on. And so that's just temperamentally, that's what I prefer. But I'd like to see more of that, to be honest, in interfaith dialogue. I don't think that there's enough deep discussion of philosophical and theological issues pertaining to interfaith hermeneutics. Thank you.
But how is the reaction then? I mean, if you just talk about it, I mean, in these programs, I mean, do people want to talk or just?
No, but what they do is they sort of like superficially agree. I mean, yes, we accept all religions true as well, right? But they don't. But if you push them on it, they're not going to go much deeper than that. Just to give you an example, I'm friends with Francis Clooney at Harvard, and he's a Jesuit professor at the Harvard Divinity School, and his official position is the Catholic one, which is Nostra Aetate. It's an inclusivism, but he spent his entire career working on Hinduism, and he loves Hinduism. But there's this kind of, it seems to me, and I think to others like Perry Schmidt-Leukel in Münster, that there's a real tension there between his official inclusivist stance and his practice on the other. And so I feel that it's very common in interfaith dialogue that there's a kind of performative contradiction in professing to embrace all the world religions, but then when you actually ask them about their religious standpoints, it's not nearly as liberal most of the time, as far as I can tell.
I see. Thank you. There's another question of Haji. How does Ramakrishna's concept of religious pluralism challenge or reshape traditional notions of religious exclusivity and superiority?
Yeah, I think it does so in a really radical way, in a number of respects. First of all, because I hope that when I mentioned the threefold typology of Alan Race, that I think his model of religious diversity falls squarely in the religious pluralist camp. And so it clearly contradicts and argues against exclusivism, but I think it equally rejects this idea of superiority, which I think is your version of inclusivism, the idea of a higher and a lower, that my religion is the best or the highest, and other religions aren't hopeless or wrong, but they kind of only take you part of the way or are kind of only indirect. Ramakrishna rejected all of those, all that talk of higher and lower, of hierarchies, and he really embraced the equal salvific efficacy of multiple world religions, and I think that's quite radical. Now, to what extent other people will accept it is another question with it.
But how is it then in the Hindu traditional thinking, and how is it reshape the traditional idea of Hinduism?
Oh, I see. Within Hinduism, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, look. I mean, I get the sense because I lived in India for 13 years, and I just got back to the U.S. last August. So I can speak from experience that, I mean, if you talk to just Hindus on the street who are not academically trained, their kind of knee-jerk way of explaining other religions and where they stand in relation to Hinduism is very much along the lines of Ramakrishna, is that all the different religions are calling on the same God in different forms and aspects. But it's very kind of, we can call it pre-philosophical or whatever. But there are some people who actually follow inclusivist or even sometimes exclusivist strains of Hinduism, traditions within Hinduism. So it would be wrong to say that all Hindus follow Ramakrishna's, pluralist view. That's not true. A large number kind of intuitively channel the pluralist position of Ramakrishna, but there are others who adopt a more higher, lower kind of superiority view based usually in Advaita Vedanta. And there are some who are very exclusivistic and who say that only our path based on bhakti toward Krishna, one particular form of the personal God, can lead to salvation. And other paths are sort of hopeless. I mean, this is also, it's less common, thankfully, in India.
I mean, the most common is inclusivism, right? I mean,
I don't think so, actually, to be honest. I'm saying again, it depends on whom you're asking. But if you go to universities, you might get inclusivism. if you talk to villagers in India, I don't think you're going to get more of a pluralism, as far as I can tell.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, now we have some questions from the audience. I would say Fariza.
Yes, thank you. First of all, thanks for the great lecture. I enjoyed it a lot. And my question would be, what does Ramakrishna say about non-religious people at all? Because we like often talk about interreligious dialogue and so on, but we have also many people who believe themselves to be atheists and so on. And what does Ramakrishna say about these people, or do they fall under the like non-dual sphere of like what you talked about?
Right. Yeah, some do. I mean, so Advaita Vedanta, the non-dual path, is, if you really want to push them on it, they're atheistic in a certain sense, because they don't believe in the ultimate reality of the personal God, but they believe in the ultimate reality of non-dual pure consciousness. So there are some atheists who are still spiritual in the sense of believing in some kind of transcendental reality other than the personal God. And so Ramakrishna obviously accords, a perfectly respectable place to them as well. And what he says is that through the path of non-dualism, you can also attain the highest goal. But there are other kinds of atheists who don't believe in any kind of transcendental reality. But Buddhists are another example, actually, of either atheists or agnostics. I mean, it depends on what form of Buddhism you're talking about. But Ramakrishna will say that they can also attain the same goal, the highest goal, in the form of nirvana. If you're talking about atheists, like ordinary atheists who really don't believe in any religious or spiritual framework, I think this actually comes up in one place, and he says he encourages people who don't believe in God to pray to God to kind of give them light, basically. So that's a short answer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have another question from the audience, Ms. Ayubi.
Yes, I have a question regarding Ramakrishna's opinion that not all religions are true, but all of them are salvifically efficacious, you said. Isn't that contradictory? Because I thought that for
Ms. Ayubi, we lost you. Ms. Ayubi?
yes,
Now,
can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you, but we lost you. Is it possible to repeat your question, please?
Yes. So again, my question was regarding Ramakrishna's opinion that not all religions are true, but they are salvifically efficacious. And I thought that this somehow sounded really contradictory, because for the religions to be true, to be leading to the ultimate truth, they have to be true themselves.
Okay, I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, but so on my understanding of Ramakrishna, he pries apart a religion's doctrinal truth from its salvific efficacy. And he's saying that there are many doctrines in a religion that may not be true, but even if religions get certain things wrong at a doctrinal level, it doesn't handicap those religions from the standpoint of salvation. Because the essence of all religions actually is just longing for God. And if you have that longing, God himself will show you the errors and kind of correct your understanding. That seems to be his view.
Okay, now I hope it answered your question, Ms. Ayubi. If not, just type your question into the chat, then we could take it again. Ms. Baluch.
Yeah, I had like a similar question actually to my colleague Shama, but I do have another question, which is like what you said about Ramakrishna, that that no religion actually captures the whole truth.
Mm-hmm.
And you showed us a quotation which says it doesn't matter if you take a wrong path. So my question is like, what is actually considered as the wrong path, since no religion actually captures the whole truth, only part of it?
Right. What's the wrong path? I mean, I think what he means is, remember, he doesn't think that any religion is 100% true. And so you use whatever lights you have to start with and on the religious path. And if you start out believing something that turns out not to be true, that's still okay. If you're sincere as a religious practitioner, that seems to be the idea. And so, yeah, I mean, it's just wrong. I mean, there are doctrinal errors in all religions, right? Seems to be his view.
But I mean, maybe we could think further to this question and ask about the criteriological problem. I mean, does Ramakrishna has a criteria for religions which is more true or less true?
Yeah, I think he does. I mean, in general, what he says is a religion has to prescribe ethical and spiritual practices that have the aim of eliminating egoism and selfishness. And so a path or a tradition won't even count as a religion if it prescribes violence, for instance. And so that eliminates, for instance, religiously inspired terrorist organizations, Al-Qaeda or Aum Shinrikyo in Japan and these other things. Even though they call themselves religious, they're actually not religious because they're encouraging or supporting violence and killing. So that's one fundamental criterion. And the other one is basically, he says that a religion has to capture some aspect of the ultimate reality. So whether in the form of the personal God or in some impersonal aspect, like nirvana or pure consciousness.
Okay, thank you. Now, Ammar has a question. Please, Ammar.
Yeah, many thanks for the very enlightening talk. And perhaps you've answered my question in the first 10 minutes. I've missed them. So if this is the case, sorry for that. But I was wondering about whether Ramakrishna's views fit in the views of the representatives of the so-called Philosophia Perennis. So for instance, Said Hossein Nasr, very famous representative in the US, who argues that there is a philosophy which is not limited to one single religion and which can be defended by all the religions because it is directed towards the ultimate reality that grounds all the religions. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Yeah. No, I think that's a great question. And in fact, I attended a conference last year at Notre Dame on perennial philosophy. And my presentation was on Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta as a form of perennial philosophy. But the key is that there are different forms of perennial philosophy. So I think we should avoid the mistake of saying that there's only one kind of perennial philosophy. But I think it's basically right to think that Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta is a kind of meta religion or a meta framework on the basis of which one can practice any religion. And so I think that's true. Now, I mean, what form of perennial philosophy? I think it comes closest to Aldous Huxley's perennial philosophy. He wrote a book called Perennial Philosophy, and it's not a coincidence because he was actually influenced by Ramakrishna. He would frequent the society that I'm at now, the Vedanta Society of Southern California, Aldous Huxley, and meet with Swami Prabhavananda. He was initiated in our tradition, and so his version of perennial philosophy is colored by Ramakrishna. And so that's the kind of, I think that is the kind of, that comes closer to the form of perennial philosophy that Ramakrishna endorsed than Fritjof Schuon or Nasser. And to go into the details, it'll take kind of, I'm going to work that out, and there's going to be a volume coming out based on the conference at Notre Dame. And my contribution will be on Ramakrishna's form of perennial philosophy in relation to people like you're talking about, Nasser and Schuon. So stay tuned for that. Thank you.
May I just ask one quick question, follow-up, just to know, just to have some ideas how it will be. Could you just mention perhaps one difference, for instance, that Ramakrishna's view has in contrast to Sayyid Hossein Nasr's or Fritjof Schuon's view?
Right. Okay. So I mean, I think it depends on how you interpret them. But for instance, so let me ask you a question, maybe, and then that'll help me as a follow-up. Like, do they believe in, for instance, a perennialist understanding of spiritual experience? Do they think that the Muslims' experience of God is identical phenomenologically to the Christians or the Advaita Vedantins or the Buddhists?
I think no.
No? Okay, so if no, then that actually comes closer to Ramakrishna. I think there are some forms of perennial philosophy which sort of say that everybody's experiencing God in the same way. Like a Walter Stace kind of a view. I don't know if you've read his book, Mysticism and Philosophy. But so, I mean, basically part of the reason for writing that article is because I want to go more deeply into Schuon and Nasser. But go ahead. Yeah, please.
Okay,
Uh,
I
Yeah.
just wanted to correct myself. Yes, they believe that there is a difference.
A difference between the different experiences of God. Is that right? Yes. I mean, if that's true, then at that level, I think Ramakrishna would just agree with them. I want to, it's for the purposes of the article, I'm going to actually go much more deeply into studying Schuon and Nasser, and then I can give a more specific answer about where exactly I see them differing, if at all. Yeah. So that's pending work, basically. I haven't done it yet.
I think I'm going to pick pick this also up. I mean, and read about it, because also Said Nasser is also part of my research. That's why it's very interesting to see that you write also about his perennialistic ideas. Okay, now follow up. We have another question of Fiza and 2 questions in the chat. I think we will also summarize it with these 3. We will also end with these 3 questions. Now, Fiza.
Okay, so first of all, I wanted to thank you for your talk. I don't often hear about Hinduism, so it was very enlightening to hear about it and about the philosophies. And so because I don't really often read about it or talk about it or just hear about it in general, I wanted to ask you what exactly this pure consciousness is. Because you mentioned that there's this like personal God that you can yearn for and then achieve this sort of liberation in a way. And then there's also this like personal pure consciousness, but I don't really get the concept of that. Could you please elaborate?
Sure. Yeah. I hope I didn't say personal pure consciousness. It's impersonal pure consciousness.
Oh, sorry. Then it must have been my mistake.
Yeah. So it's non-dual pure consciousness. And the idea in the tradition of Advaita Vedanta is that it's a mistake to think that we're the physical body or even that we're minds, but that in our deepest essence, we are actually identical with non-dual pure consciousness. And if you want to ask more specifically what that is, it's a little problematic. I mean, because it's apophatic. I mean, so you can't really describe it, but you can just be it. But one of the terms that they tend to use is Sat-Chit Ananda, existence, consciousness, bliss. And that's our deepest essence. I mean, it's completely devoid of suffering and impersonal in the sense that it's completely devoid of attributes. And so it's not even the personal God with the omni attributes. But that's our true nature, and that's the only reality. So that's why it's Advaita. Nothing else exists other than that non-dual pure consciousness. So if you're interested in more details, you can look at Shankara's commentaries on the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, and Brahma Sutra. That's where he explains it.
So that's why you should leave all individuality, because in essence you're just bliss and
and non-dual. Yeah, exactly.
And non-dual.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure listening to you.
Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you for the question and for the answers. Now we are going on with the following question from Betul. Is Ramakrishna's concept primarily a philosophical theory similar to John Hicks pluralism, or does it have theological implications as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does have theological implications. I mean, it really depends on how you distinguish, how you carve up philosophy and theology here. But for instance, I mean, in my work, I talk about how his Vijnana Vedanta gives a novel response to the problem of evil, which is a theological issue, but it's also philosophical. So he provides a novel theodicy based on karma and rebirth and universal salvation. Universal salvation is something I didn't mention, but it's crucial to theodicy. There's not a single soul who will not be saved at the end. There's no eternal hell in Ramakrishna's view. So that's also, I think, significant to his religious pluralism.
I mean, in Ramakrishna's ideas, there is no hell. I mean, there's no
eternal hell. Yeah,
there's no eternal. I mean, is there something where people suffer? I mean,
there could be a purgative state of between lives. If you do, like a Hitler might have most likely suffered in between lives, but as a kind of purgative experience, so that he would be purged of bad karma and then would assume another physical body in his next birth.
I mean, but how is it that, I mean, this is in Ramakrishna's, I mean, Hitler wasn't a Hindu. I mean, that's why he was, sorry?
Well, no, he doesn't care who's Hindu, not Hindu, right?
So yeah, I mean, he also believes, I mean, this is what I've understand in Ramakrishna's idea, that everyone gets his own heaven. I mean, gets his own idea of heaven or what they believe.
After they attain salvation, but that's not. I mean, Hitler's not getting salvation until he sees Hitler. I mean, I mean, Ramakrishna agreed with Christ. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. So the idea is you need to be pure in heart. How many people in this world are pure in heart? So that's why the belief in rebirth and karma is so important, because in one life, almost none of us are going to be able to achieve that level of moral and spiritual perfection that's necessary for salvation. So we keep coming back until we purify ourselves to the point where we become saintly. And then when we leave the physical body in our last birth, then we attain the highest goal in whatever form that we're seeking God. Does that make sense?
But I mean, I didn't get the point where for instance, if you are a Christian or a Muslim, then there's in Ramakrishna's idea, you also get your own, like you believe in your own heaven.
Yeah.
And there's no rebirth, right?
No, but the thing is, until a Muslim or a Christian attains spiritual perfection and moral perfection, they're also not going to reach their respective heavens.
Okay.
I think that's true to the traditions of Islam too. Islam is not saying everybody's going to go to heaven just by saying, I love the Quran. You have to do some practice. And
no, it doesn't.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Now we have a last question. It's a personal one. Swami, how should one deal with the truth claims of religion? And the second, how do you deal with it personally?
I mean, I hope I answered the first question in the last few slides where I explained his response to the problem of conflicting religious truth claims. So I guess I'll tackle more of the second question, which is how do I deal with it personally? So as a spiritual practitioner, I can say in a tradition of Vedanta, I actively try to learn from other religions, and I actively try to study other religions in the scriptures of different religions, and I also try to incorporate aspects of different religious traditions and the spiritual practices taught in the different traditions in my own daily practice. So I incorporate aspects of Buddhist mindfulness. I incorporate aspects of Muslim devotion and surrender. In the Christian tradition, I love, for instance, hesychasm, this tradition of repetition of the divine name, which is called japa in Sanskrit. So there are many things, and another form of practice that I like is listening to sacred classical music. Like Christian music, like psalms or masses that are put to music by people like Bach and Mozart. Yeah, so that's just one example.
So thank you very much, Swami. Thank you for your insightful talk and for the answers. Unfortunately, we are out of time. We're actually 10 minutes above, and I also wanted to thank for all the participants. We have, we have participants from, I see, from more than 3 or 4 countries, and I hope to see you again in 2 weeks, where we have another point of view to pluralism or interfaith understanding of religion from the Alevi point of view. And let's see you in 2 weeks, and have a good night. Good morning.
Thank you, everyone, for the wonderful questions. Take care.